It is the mystic's craft to transcend illusion and reconcile the sufferings of human life with an immediate divine reality. The mystical are not inclined to perturb their life's purpose, such as it is, but to achieve it by harmonizing with a self-transcending presence, to know God through direct union. In the art of peeking beyond the firmament of the daily ego, the mystic makes private voyages to smuggle back answers to every young philosopher's gambit of why have we come here, what are we supposed to do, how have we forgotten our spiritual nature. In esoteric parlance, the mystic is an initiate who realizes the soul through altered states, inspired visions, out-of-body experiences, and creative contemplation. In the records of history, there have always been those who prefer to eat the sacrament directly from God's hands. Mystical experiences are found in every sect and region. What was learned through ascensions and visions was distilled into parables and disciplines. Many fragrant flowers of theology were returned to the world from better gardens beyond. The purpose of this essay, then, is to demonstrate a few major theological principles that mystics of many schools have qualified through direct experience and continual practice. We have at best a faulty notion of our life beyond the world. We can mostly only imagine the challenge incurred by our soul's compression into such a rigid material form. Mysteries proliferate as we apply ourselves to enlightening the unknowns behind this diorama. Even if we encircle a few collective truths, applying knowledge does not look the same for everyone, and it is only by our actions, beliefs, and interpretations that we can unbind the knots preventing us from living in accord with God. Our individual lives are unique and cannot always be fulfilled through the common advice of self-denial. Total renunciation of worldly affairs may be in season for some of us. For others, the embodiment of virtues amidst our attachments and relationships is necessary for our specific path up the common mountain. Regardless of what methods the individual might tailor to suit their life, many theological principles are as universal as the means used to learn them. Many theologies differ as to what our ultimate purpose is, even after accepting the existence of God, the ultimate divine presence, and soul, our signature and eternal self. But among the mystical traditions of the world, there is a kind of recurring theological sparring match as to who can posit the greatest version of God. Some exponents of the Hindu school of Vedanta, cautious not to give any attribute to Brahman, have posited a para-Brahman. This even less fathomable divine reality cannot be described and transcends all causes and separateness. We find similarity in this ineffably raised concept of God among the Kabbalists who, not limiting themselves to Old Testament characteristics of Yahweh, have suggested an Ein Sof, or an infinite beingness that transcends all attributes. Much like the Tao that cannot be described, the Godhead of Christian mysticism, the Al-Haq of Sufism, the Sunyata of Mahayana Buddhism, the pre-principle that exists before a beginning and without an end of Hermeticism, the pre-cosmic state that existed prior to individual entities of the Orphic system, and the omniscient, all-knowing Ahura Mazda of Zoroastrianism. Though each school employs different methods, they arrive at roughly the same conclusion. Whether through inward stillness or outward exercise, mystics the world over have found reasons to amplify their praise of creation through any number of tools. Raising God above the common notions of a personified deity is but one common sound in the collective theological opera. There are, as we will see, many more universal tones of mysticism that strike the ear in the same frequency, though they are sung from different voices. It is entirely natural that humans, sharing a common world and common conditions, should develop common understandings. But even the deepest understandings of the soul are not solely the fruit of spiritual ecstasy or out-of-body experience. Nature herself is clothed in many garments that veil transcendent truths. In the seemingly mundane stuff of the world, the results of a divine order carry out exact processes, down to the smallest possible unit within the unit. Processes visible in material forms, but so irreducibly complex that no single function or part can be removed without the entire system collapsing. Human awareness mounts the summit of its own physical unit, a body-mind self which we often identify with, even though it digests food outside of our control, receives thoughts without prior calculation, and inspires dreams so beyond our imagination we must finally suggest there is another force at work. This force beats our hearts, breathes in our sleep, and blinks our eyes beyond the narrow limits of conscious awareness. We often say we have a body, unconsciously admitting that the possessing principle stands apart from the possession. Many spiritual archetypes are puzzled inside everyday language and natural observation. We do not require complex occult practices to gain insight into a more complete spiritual worldview. At an instinctual level, we can embody the grace and balance of nature without great effort. We can return our attention to the breath and feel the immediate benefit. Breath alone grants the mystic more rewards than, say, conceptualizing the in-between realms of the Tibetan Bardo, the Egyptian Duat, the Greek Elysium, or the Catholic Purgatory. Because no matter what manner of afterlife realms exist, it is the actions we take here and now that affect the quality of our navigation through such realms. And so we are once again returned to the immediacy of the moment. Several, if not all, spiritual archetypes are impressed onto nature's processes. They lie directly before the eye and can be unconsciously transmitted in everyday speech. Some mystical and mythological language is as ubiquitous as the daily sublime truths. The timeless orientation of heaven and hell evokes descriptions of high and low locations, even though the heavens as a spiritual region is an abstraction we cannot fully experience while embodied, and hell is prototypically a fear-induced region of darkness, where souls grope at illusions in perpetual denial of the light. The starry heavens perceived by sight are the object of upward wonder. When our local sun is briefly obstructed, greater stars are revealed which flirt with our sense of mystery. Heavy has a negative connotation. Heaviness and density bring objects downward to the earth. Negative emotions are burdensome and described as possessing great weight, whereas lightness is a positive description. Whatever is lighter can move upward with less force. Cold reduces movement and is a choice adjective for a human who lacks emotional awareness. Heat implies energy, movement, and ascension. Our every sense of value is, in this way, vertically oriented and can be cast in a dualistic framework. Classic dualisms forever postulate two polarizing forces, light and dark, positive and negative, good and evil. Dualism can also distinguish between the individual soul and the ultimate reality, the soul and the body, the real and the unreal. Dualisms in all their forms have been the subject of routine criticism because they cannot always apply to the overarching, unified reality and are solely relative conveniences. For instance, my up relative to my position on the earth can be someone else's down on the other side. From the galactic perspective, my up doesn't exist. Even though my sense of up is true to me, it is dependent on the relative condition of my location. Dualism in its many forms is useful in much the same way. As a tool of immediate relevance, much can be learned by entertaining the universe through the dualistic lens. The classic fall of the soul narrative contains any number of variations to a timeless story of dual forces. We can entertain the fall as the beginning of the intensification of separation and dualistic experience, the introduction of an opposing force. The fall is a downward deviation from totality and unity. In classical mythological imagery, spirits that disrupt the divine hierarchy are those who descend, like the fallen angels of the Enochian myth, who bound themselves to an oath before descending to take wives among mortal women and providing inventions and arts later corrupted by man, like defiant Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and brought it to man, or curious Pandora, who was sent to the earth as a punishment to man, who later opens her jar and releases all the evils. The Zoroastrian god of darkness, evil, and deceit is Ahriman, who existed in the darkness from the beginning and therefore had no conception of Ahura Mazda, who is in the light. Ahriman chooses to corrupt the creatures of Ahura Mazda and feeds into humanity's dualistic existence as one part corruptible and evil and one part divine and pure. In popular mythology, Lucifer falls due to his disobedience. He turns away from a life in service to God to pursue the ambition of worldly rule, in service to lower desires, material avarice, and manipulative cunning. Jesus once described Satan too as falling like lightning from the heavens. It was taught among the followers of Orpheus that the body is the tomb of the soul. Much as the Pythagorean philosopher Philolaus said, the ancient theologians and seers testify that the soul is conjoined to the body to suffer certain punishments, and is, as it were, buried in this tomb. Greek philosophers had expressed this fall outside the mythological traditions while maintaining the basic theme. In Plato's Phaedrus, we are told the soul is winged when it is perfect and governs the whole world, but when it is weighed down by the body's evils and is filled with what is alien to it, it sheds its wings and falls to the earth, and the whole, compounded of soul and body, is called a living being, and is further designated as mortal. In this state, it can no longer soar aloft, but is bound to the visible, corporeal realm. Plotinus expands on the fall and designates the soul's descent into matter and body as, quote, a kind of darkening, a kind of forgetting its own nature, and it is this which is meant when we speak of the soul's fall. The fall of the soul was communicated in the Greek mystery religions and many of their associated myths. It is succinctly captured in these famous lines of Virgil. The gates of hell are open night and day. Smooth the descent and easy is the way. But to return and view the cheerful skies, in this the task and mighty labor lies. Choosing evil and succumbing to the temptations of short-term pleasures is always the tendency of a lower nature, lower by every metric and heavy with consequences for any soul seeking liberation. Theological duality is open to criticism in that it speaks to the truths of a lower world and does not satisfy greater mysteries. However, this does not make it useless. The felt experience of the emotional spectrum in the neutral state will always posit a positive and negative, and even a third dimension in between. While dualism has its weaknesses depending on where it is applied, it is the great imposing theme and habit of human reality. The early Christian theologian Origen saw in Genesis and the writings of Paul the two men in every man, saying, "There are two men in every one of us. Of these two men he tells us that the one, namely the inner man, is renewed from day to day, but the other, that is, the outer, he declares to be corrupted and weakened." Compare this to the classic dual nature of man in Zoroastrianism, where, in the Yasna, we read, "These two primal spirits, which are twins, have been known to the wise. They are the better and the bad in thought, word, and deed. Between these two, the wise ones choose rightly, the foolish ones not so." In the Hindu Katha Upanishad, where Yama, the god of death, finally gives the young Nachiketa his third boon, Yama says, "One thing is the good, another the pleasant. These two, having different objects, chain a man. Blessedness attends on him who, of the two, takes the good. He who chooses the pleasant misses the end." We can point to many examples of humanity, and not just the individual human, seeming to fragment into halves, religiously, politically, and philosophically. We live this as an experience, knowing at once, however, that not everyone is exactly polarized. We see in nature that summer and winter bring about polarization, and yet some places of the world do not endure the same degree of seasonal changes. We see duality in wet and dry, hot and cold, on and off, life and death respectively. While dualisms are relative and not always applicable to the greater cosmos, and unity is absolute, dualistic frameworks are fundamental to understanding the universal theology and the story of the human soul. As the old Hermetic principle goes, the small can reveal the large, the below is like unto the above, and in thus lies the miracle of the one thing. In a world where evil or negative choices can be collectively made so often, we imagine another world where goodness is so intoxicatingly permanent that the chances for evil actions are so slim they would seem impossible. This imagined reality would not give way to such a degree of bifurcation. Darkness, therefore, is always the result of an absence of light, and ignorance an absence of knowledge, much as evil is a deficiency of good in the Hermetic definitions. In our daily lives, the night is the earth's shadow, and the temporary illusion of the sun's absence. The light, much like the sun, still is at night, though we cannot perceive it but for its reflection on other celestial objects. It will return nonetheless, and in this way it has served as the premier natural symbol of the soul's immortal return through the darkness of bodily existence. The various authors, writing under the sagely Greco-Egyptian pseudonym of Hermes Trismegistus, taught that nature is the mirror of truth. The latter is at once the body of the incorporeal things and the light of the invisible. Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, likewise recognized a singular system which offers harmony to its beings. Quote, all things are part of one single system, which is called nature. The individual life is good when it is in harmony with nature. And the Stoic Epictetus, quote, you, on the other hand, are a creature placed in charge, and a particle of God himself. There is a bit of God within you. You carry God around with you and you don't know it, poor fool. As one Zen Buddhist monk of the 7th century put it, one nature, perfect and pervading, circulates in all natures. One reality, all-comprehensive, contains within itself all realities. Many mystical traditions teach that a soul may better perceive God's singularity through imitating the activity or inactivity of that sole being who seeks nothing, transcends cause, and yet causes all that is. As Hermes taught one pupil, quote, if you have not made yourself like God, you are not able to understand God, for like is only understandable to like. Taking this approach, we may at one time exemplify the quiet nothingness of God through an inward meditation and a cancellation of sensory stimuli. Draw into yourself and it will come, says Hermes. Will it, and it happens. Suspend the perceptions of the body and there will be generation of divinity. Cleanse yourself from the irrational avengers of matter. At the same time, Hermes taught us to engage the imagination and the active mind, the mind ultimately being united with God's singular consciousness. Quote, I no longer picture things with the sight of my eyes, but with the mental energy that comes through the powers. I am in heaven, in earth, in water, in air. I am in animals, in plants, in the womb, before the womb, after the womb, everywhere. In the mind we may rise higher than every height and lower than every depth. The mystical Hermetic imagination is further asked to collect in yourself all the sensations of what has been made, of fire and water, dry and wet. Be everywhere at once, on land, in the sea, in heaven. Be not yet born, be in the womb, be young, old, dead, beyond death. And when you have understood all these at once, times, places, things, qualities, quantities, then you can understand God. By these methods, we exercise and refine the unbroken connection between our individuated consciousness and the universal mind. Across a range of traditions, there was no doubt about the singularity of the ultimate essence of God. Ancient Greeks from Xenophanes and Xenocrates to Pythagoras are credited with teachings that maintain the oneness of divinity at the level of the first cause. The mystical bard Orpheus was once treated with appreciation by a Christian father for having written, quote, "He is one, self-proceeding, and from him alone all things proceed, and in them he himself exerts his activity. No mortal beholds him, but he beholds all. But linger no longer, O man, endued with varied wisdom, but turn and retrace your steps, and propitiate God." This is the prime mover of Aristotle, who is what men call God, and who, to Aristotle, must be immortal and unchangeable. The one, says Plotinus, the great Neoplatonist, is all things, and yet none of them. It is the source of all things, not all things, and thus it is beyond all things. As the Chinese Buddhist Jianzi Xingkan wrote, "When the 10,000 things are viewed in their oneness, we return to the origin and remain where we have always been." The famous quote from the Hellenized Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria is no less emphatic on this point. "He who thinks that God has inequality and is not the one injures not God, but himself." The Christian mystic Meister Eckhart echoes this in various places, saying, quote, "Thou must love God as not God, not spirit, not person, not image, but as he is, a sheer, pure absolute one, surrendered from all two-ness, and in whom we must eternally sink from nothingness to nothingness." This is no less the advice of the great Vedantic philosopher Shankara, who said, "Talk as much philosophy as you please, worship as many gods as you like, observe all ceremonies, sing devoted praises to any number of divine beings. Liberation never comes, even at the end of 100 eons, without the realization of the oneness of self." In the Vedic Maitrayana Upanishad we read, "Having realized his own self as the self, a man becomes selfless, and in virtue of selflessness, he is to be conceived as unconditioned. This is the highest mystery, betokening emancipation. Through selflessness, he has no part in pleasure or pain, but attains absoluteness." Thus we come to the mystical ascent from ego-self and body-mind personality to the transcendent essential self, the Vedantic Atman, equivalent in many ways to the Western concept of the soul or the oversoul, who may act as the guardian angel, the Zoroastrian Fravashi, the Platonic personal daemon, the disembodied higher mind that never leaves the mountain peak, never shrinks from that presiding vista above, but is the trunk of the tree that branches into many incarnations. The Chandogya Upanishad teaches that this body is mortal, forever in the clutch of death, but within it resides the self, immortal and without form. This self, when associated in consciousness with the body, is subject to pleasure and pain. So long as this association continues, no man can find freedom from pains and pleasures. But when the association comes to an end, there is an end also of pain and pleasure. Rising above physical consciousness, knowing the self as distinct from the sense organs and the mind, knowing him in his true light, one rejoices and one is free. It is through the act of quieting the ego mind that the essential self is revealed in its unbroken unity with the first principle. The higher self is not necessarily equated with the first principle in totality, or it would not experience any independence. It is rather an emanation, a beacon, ray, or arrow of light shooting out from a central sphere. As the great Chinese Taoist of the 4th century BC, Chuang Tzu, says, "Do not ask whether the principle is in this or in that. It is in all beings. It is on this account that we apply to it the epithets of supreme, universal, total. It is the author of causes and effects, but is not the causes and effects. All proceeds from it and is under its influence. It is in all things, but is not identical with beings, for it is neither differentiated nor limited." The ancient Egyptian theology of Atonism, espoused by the pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BC, is an early expression of the unified Godhead, appropriately explained through solar symbolism. The great hymn to Aten, found on the tomb of A in Amarna, contains, quote, "O how many are the things which thou hast made! They are hidden from the face, O thou one God, like whom there is no other. O thou Lord of every land, thou shinest upon them, O Aten of the day, thou great one of majesty. Thou makest the life of all remote lands. Thy being is one. Thou shinest among thy creatures as the living Aten, rising, shining, departing afar off, returning. Every eye beholdeth thee confronting it. Thou thyself art afar off, but thy beams are upon the earth. It is within the same vein of solar contemplation that the 11th century Italian Saint Anselm describes the relationship of God with the individual. Quote, Lord, this is the unapproachable light in which thou dwellest. Truly I see it not, because it is too bright for me. And yet whatever I see through it, as the weak eye sees what it sees through the light of the sun, which in the sun itself it cannot look upon. O supreme and unapproachable light, O holy and blessed truth, how far art thou from me, who am so near to thee? How far art thou removed from my vision, though I am so near to thine? The sun's light is the medium through which we see. It touches us, but we cannot capture it. We cannot look at the sun directly for too long without special instruments. We feel its warmth when it is on us, and with its absence our souls naturally quit the body for sleep. Both the Egyptian Atenist of the 14th century BC and the Christian mystic, over 2,000 years later, compare God's remoteness and his intimate proximity to the qualities of our local star. Beyond locality, however, if our vision could be adjusted in real time to see light at unlimited distances through space, there would be nothing but light in the heavens to see. The septillion stars, shining and filling all the previous gaps of seemingly void space between. But on account of the filters and limits of the human system, we are necessarily keyed in to our local environment, which nevertheless expresses familiar archetypes across the perceivable universe. The imagination and the powers of consciousness, however, can stretch beyond physical limits. Most philosophies identifying the divine aspects of the human being posit one or another power of intelligence, logos, nous, intellect, or consciousness as the feature that binds us to the universal mind, which is a stream all conscious beings partake of, flowing from the fountainhead of the highest order. Of the Egyptian mystics, the Syrian Neoplatonist Iamblichus explains that they distinguish life and intellect from physical causes and physical being. Quote, they place intellect and reason first as self-existent, and from those they derive the created world. As parent of generated things, they constitute a demiurge, and acknowledge a vital force both in the heavens and before the heavens. They place pure intellect above and beyond the universe, and another consisting of one continuous mind pervading the universe and apportioned to all its parts and spheres. And now that the power of mind and consciousness is understood to be intrinsically linked with the first principle, Iamblichus hints to the method of mystical ascension known among Hermetists and beyond. They certainly do not just speculate about these things. They recommend rising up through priestly theurgy toward the higher and more universal levels above fate, to the god and craftsman, and without material attachment or any other help at all except observing the proper time. Such timeless understanding hardly escaped the English Christian mystic William Law. Quote, though God is everywhere present, yet he is only present to thee in the deepest and most central part of thy soul. The natural senses cannot possess God or unite thee to him. Nay, thy inward faculties of understanding, will and memory can only reach after God, but cannot be the place of his habitation in thee. But there is a root or depth of thee from whence all these faculties come forth, as lines from a center or as branches from the body of the tree. In the Hermetic ascension, the soul must transcend the avenging daemons to behold the nous. Hermes teaches that any symbol or teaching about this vision is a fabrication at best, a feeble instrument used to perceive inherently esoteric and ineffable experiences. What can I say, my child, says Hermes. I've nothing to tell except this. Seeing within me an unfabricated vision that came from the mercy of God, I went out of myself into an immortal body, and now I am not what I was before. This thing cannot be taught. nor can it be seen through any elementary fabrication that we use here below. As the Vedantic philosopher Shankara taught, quote, caste, creed, family, and lineage do not exist in Brahman. Brahman has neither name nor form, transcends merit and demerit, is beyond time, space, and the objects of sense experience. Such is Brahman, and thou art that. In Hermetic and Vedantic mysticism, the soul can perceive itself as the whole intelligible world. The personal identity becomes merely a phase, and we ascend into a more formless region inhabited by pure divinities. It is much the same in Neoplatonic thought. Emperor Julian, for one, speaks of one benefit bestowed on the soul by his personal God as that which, quote, frees them from the body, and then lifts them up on high to the region of those substances that are akin to the God, and the fineness and vigor of his divine rays, which are assigned as a sort of vehicle for the safe descent of our souls into this world of generation. As Hermes Trismegistus said, you can even become a god if you want, for it is possible. Therefore want and understand and believe and love, then you have become it. The French theologian Bernard of Clairvaux understands the same transformation from the ego-self experienced in holy visions. Quote, I would say that man is blessed and holy to whom it is given to experience something of this sort, so rare in life, even if it be but once and for the space of a moment, to lose yourself, as if you no longer existed, to cease completely to experience yourself. To reduce yourself to nothing is not a human sentiment, but a divine experience. When, in the apocalyptic 11th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna longs to see Krishna's form as God of nature and the world, Krishna, as an incarnation of the Godhead, tells Arjuna he will behold the entire universe inside his body, where all the gods and all the multitudes of beings dwell. Arjuna says, O Lord of the universe, I see in your body many, many arms, bellies, mouths, and eyes, expanded everywhere, without limit. I see in you no end, no middle, and no beginning. The Buddhist concept of Sunyata offers a neat segue into further discussion about the quality, or rather non-quality, of the first principle. Sunyata translates as emptiness, vacuity, or voidness, but if it is ever constructed as actual nothingness, this must be incorrect on its face. Sunyata is not non-existence. Non-existence, by definition, cannot exist. Sunyata is not without the one, it is without the self, and is an attempt to identify the most reducible existent, the closest possible experience to inexperience. Emptiness in this way is the only conceivable experience of self when the self unites with the one. Emptiness would be the experience of the one if the one did not create any secondary dimension to interact with. The first emanation from the one, therefore, the fount of consciousness that creates, is often what God is thought to be. True emptiness is not aware of anything, and in Buddha's words, quote, the mind is the source of all phenomena, and all phenomena are nothing but mind. Outside of mind there is no reality. Rather it is the simple isness of the one that is simultaneously the last unit found in the microcosm and the first unit of the macrocosm. Isness will never be emptiness. The first thought of the formless always is. The first thought in itself is not a beginning that had a prequel of nothingness. The first thought of the one fulfilled the one as all that is. To put it in linear terms, as soon as the one had its first thought, all things that ever are and ever could be instantly came into existence. As if there is but one essential wave particle that holographically distributes itself across every dimension. In this way, we are an emanation of the one experiencing itself. We are one and thou art that. St. John of the Cross appears to disagree with the Apostle Paul when he says, quote, never forget that God is inaccessible. Yet there is nothing that can be accessed which exists apart from God. If describing God's inaccessible nature is meant to convey the reality of many intermediate realms between the immediate afterlife and the totality, then this position becomes realistic. But, as Paul has it, quote, "He is not far from any one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being." Or, as Allah in the plural is made to say in the Quran, quote, "And we have created man, and we know what his soul whispers to him, and we are nearer to him than his jugular vein." Thus it accords that there are greater and lesser degrees of living and moving and having our being within him. Two theories of mystical theology have developed to convey either God's remoteness or his immediate proximity: emanation and immanence. To some, these theories are either too diverse to reconcile or are simply two experiences of the same unity. Emanation posits a core transcendent source from which all realms and beings emanate into successively more diverse and voluminous states, as St. Thomas Aquinas had it, and because in that roof and crown of all things, God, we find the most perfect unity, and everything is stronger and more excellent the more thoroughly it is one, it follows that diversity and variety increase in all things, the further they are removed from him who is the first principle of all. The theory of immanence, by distinction, recognizes the irreducibility of oneness. The one is already omnipresent and omnibenevolent, regardless of how thick the illusions have become. God is therefore crammed into the world, tightly packing immense power into the most reducible particles of his universe. Immanence is a recognition that the earth is brimming with heavenly potential, that thy kingdom may come on earth as it is in heaven. The challenge then becomes how best to keep the sheep's wool out of our eyes and the thorns out of our hearts to behold God in all things. Doubtless, even the best among us will fail to behold infinity inside a mind tuned into the octaves of linear reality. Nonetheless, infinity does not wobble on account of our failings of perception. This has been one part of a weave through many mystical teachings expressing the same fundamental themes. Like perennial flowers in the garden, they rise up wherever mystics voyage beyond default perception and show their colors in every region and religious season. We will continue to study these cross-cultural themes and how they relate to a diverse range of mystical experiences in the essays to come. Please subscribe to the channel and give that like button the transcendental scissor kick it deserves. If you would like to support my work and tickle me from a distance, you can find the Patreon link below in the description or make a one-time donation on Venmo. As always, thank you and Happy New Year.